Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I've lived in Green Hollow Estates for nearly 20 years, a sleepy retirement community where most folks spend their days tending small gardens or meeting up for mild afternoon social gatherings. When I moved in, my plan was simple: pay off the mortgage, enjoy my twilight years, and maybe volunteer at the local historical society. I never imagined my biggest adversary would be Harriet Sullivan, head of our HOA, or that she would embroil me in an absurd, high-stakes battle involving the police and, eventually, the courts. I first met Harriet when she walked over to my house on a sunny Saturday afternoon, just as I was shooing a couple of visiting squirrels off my porch. She seemed friendly enough at a glance, white hair styled in an immaculate perm, crisp blouse, and slacks with a suspicious lack of wrinkles. Something about her posture, though, broadcasted a certain rigidity, like she moved to the beat of her own unbendable rules. She introduced herself as the newly elected president of the Green Hollow Homeowners Association and handed me a folder labeled Updated HOA Guidelines. "I hope you'll read over these at your earliest convenience," she said in a voice that reminded me of a school principal. "We'll be holding our quarterly meeting in the clubhouse next Thursday." Her eyes lingered on my porch, as if searching for a violation to note. But everything looked fine. I kept my place neat enough, nothing fancy, yet definitely not an eyesore. Harriet gave me a curt nod and left, but the energy between us felt off, even from that short interaction. A couple of weeks passed, and everything stayed quiet. Then I got a notice in my mailbox. Harriet wanted to discuss a concern regarding unusual activity at my residence. Confused, I checked my Ring doorbell footage. Harriet had marched up and taped the notice to my screen door, hardly neighborly, but okay. The next day, I called the number provided and left a voicemail. When Harriet finally responded, she sounded exasperated. "We have a new rule regarding unapproved gatherings. Neighbors have reported a suspicious group coming by your place periodically. It's creating confusion, and I'm concerned it may not align with our community values." I stared at the phone, baffled. The suspicious group she referred to must have been the 4 members of the local genealogy circle I hosted every couple of Thursdays. We were a bunch of retirees, mostly rummaging through records and old letters, trying to piece together family histories. Hardly the type to cause a row. I calmly explained that we met inside my home, quietly, for a couple of hours to compare notes. There was no loud music, no traffic jam on the street. Her response was immediate and disapproving. "But have you applied for a private event permit?" I nearly laughed. "We're not hosting a block party, Harriet. It's just a few friends. We're not violating any noise ordinance." She wouldn't budge. Green Hollow Estates rules are strict about unregistered guests coming onto the property on a recurring basis. Suddenly, I realized Harriet was all about control. She thrived on structure, on making sure every detail aligned with some carefully curated guideline. But to me, it seemed petty to classify a casual gathering of 4 seniors as some illicit event. I told her, politely, that I didn't think her new rule had any real basis in the master documents, and I suggested we talk it through at the next HOA meeting. A few days later, Harriet showed up on my porch unannounced. She was holding a notepad and a pen, her eyes scanning my living room windows as if seeking evidence of wrongdoing. I invited her inside, thinking maybe if she saw we were just flipping through dusty family records, she'd lighten up. Instead, Harriet paced around, glancing at each of my guests as though they were criminals. Then she pulled out a folder of her own, the new HOA guidelines, and pointed to a highlighted paragraph about approved events that might cause excessive foot traffic. One of my genealogy friends, Dorothy, scoffed at the definition of excessive foot traffic. "We park on the street and walk up the driveway, Harriet. That's about as harmless as it gets." Harriet pursed her lips. "Regulations are in place for a reason. If you continue to gather without applying for permission, there may be fines. Please remember, this is a private community. We can't have random people roaming about." I tried to remain calm. "We're not random people. We live here or we have explicit invitations from a resident. This is my home." Harriet's complexion tightened. "We'll see if the board agrees. I'm certainly not the only person concerned." And with that, she stormed out, leaving the rest of us dumbfounded. If Harriet had just told me she was uncomfortable or worried about something specific, like cars blocking the sidewalk, I would have heard her out. But she never gave a concrete reason, just these cryptic references to regulations and shared values. Things escalated later that week. I woke up to loud knocking at my door. 2 uniformed officers stood on my porch. Harriet stood behind them at a distance, peering over the hedge. The police informed me they'd received a tip about trespassing on private property. Harriet claimed that unauthorized individuals were constantly visiting me, trespassing on HOA land. They asked if I'd let them inside to clear things up. Although dumbfounded, I tried to stay cooperative. While one officer looked around my living room, Harriet peeked through the doorway. I could see the smug satisfaction on her face, as if she'd finally caught me in some grand scheme. Of course, the officers found nothing suspicious, just my genealogical books, dusty files, and a pot of chamomile tea on the kitchen counter. Once they realized the call was unfounded, they apologized for the interruption. Harriet stood on the porch, arms folded, lips pressed tight. She was practically vibrating with frustration. The officers ended up admonishing her, explaining that calling the police for such trivial reasons tied up resources. Harriet retreated, glaring daggers at me as she left. I was certain that would be the end of it. After all, the police had seen we were doing nothing wrong. But as I learned all too quickly, Harriet wasn't one to abandon a cause once she'd fixated on it. The next notice I received wasn't a simple letter or a knock at the door. It was an official warning from the HOA board, rehashing the unregistered gatherings complaint. And it included a preliminary fine of $500. That's when I knew this was only the beginning, and Harriet was prepared to take this as far as she could. Harriet's official warning set the tone. The board was behind her, or at least half of them were. I paid the fine under protest, thinking I could dispute it at the next meeting. $500 was no small sum, but I was more worried that this was a mere appetizer to bigger troubles. That fear became real during the monthly HOA board meeting. I walked into the clubhouse and was greeted by polite nods from a few neighbors, but Harriet and her circle sat at a central table with stacks of documents. I spotted at least 3 copies of the new HOA Code of Conduct, which Harriet had apparently updated from the original guidelines. Something about the bold red lettering on the covers made me uneasy. She called the meeting to order. "We'll begin with old business, the matter of unapproved private gatherings." Harriet's eyes locked on me. I filed an official complaint, and we have received multiple concerns from residents about repeated visitors at Mr. Learman's residence. I cleared my throat and stood up. "First, Harriet, I'd like to see these so-called complaints. Are there specific signatures from neighbors, or are they anonymous?" Harriet refused to provide names. For privacy reasons, we don't release the identities of complaint filers. I couldn't help but glance around. Most of my neighbors who were present avoided eye contact, which either meant they believed Harriet's story or feared her wrath. Harriet pressed on, explaining how the new event permit rule was enacted for safety reasons, something about limiting outside visitors who might case the neighborhood for theft. But my genealogical buddies were retirees themselves, no risk to anyone. Besides, no other houses had been singled out for gatherings. As far as I knew, 2 doors down from me, the Graysons played host to their weekly poker club. No one had cracked down on them. I made my case. I understand the goal is to keep the community safe, but these are personal friends I've known for years. This is a quiet research group. We talk about family trees, we're not even making noise. I paid the initial fine, but I want to dispute it. Nothing we do violates the original, legally binding bylaws. A couple of board members, Jim and Maria, exchanged uneasy glances, then one of them flipped through an older binder. The original guidelines only mention large-scale events that might disrupt community living, Maria said carefully. I don't see a direct reference to small gatherings inside a private home. Harriet shot them both a piercing glare. The board has the right to expand or update rules if conditions warrant. That's what we did. Jim cleared his throat. But we need homeowner input on major changes, Harriet. There should have been a vote, right? When we expand or drastically revise guidelines, that typically requires a community-wide ballot. She dismissed his concern with a wave of her hand. This is a subclause, Jim. It falls under general safety measures, so no official ballot was needed. I let out an exasperated breath. You're punishing me for something that never even went to a vote. She glowered at me with unwavering conviction. We're not punishing you. We're enforcing a regulation for the well-being of all. I tried not to roll my eyes, but it was difficult. They moved on to other agenda items, but I left the meeting feeling uneasy and defeated. Harriet seemed bent on making an example of me. What made it especially strange was that none of my immediate neighbors had ever personally complained to me. Most folks in Green Hollow Estates minded their own business and were polite if you crossed paths. It felt like Harriet was single-handedly fueling this fiasco. The following week, I got a call from an unknown number. On the other end was an officer from our local precinct. My heart skipped a beat when she mentioned Harriet's name again. We had another call alleging suspicious gatherings, the officer said, sounding almost apologetic. Frankly, this is the second time we've been asked to investigate. The first officers found nothing, so we're just logging this. But you should know your HOA president seems quite determined. It was absurd. Harriet was effectively weaponizing the police to intimidate me. And sure enough, that same afternoon, Harriet turned up on my doorstep to deliver yet another notice in person. This time, it was an order to cease and desist from hosting any non-registered gatherings. She also tacked on a threat of escalating penalties, fines of up to $2,000. Harriet, come on, I pleaded. We're both seniors here. This is ridiculous. You could just talk to me if you're worried about something. But her face remained unreadable. I'm done talking, Mr. Learman. You've proven you have no respect for the rules of this community. You'll be hearing from our attorney if you refuse to comply. Then she walked off, leaving me standing there with a piece of paper that felt like a legal sword hanging over my head. I sat in my recliner that evening, turning it over in my mind. I was just an old widower looking for a bit of companionship and intellectual stimulation in the comfort of my own home. How had it come to this? A small genealogical gathering turned into a full-blown HOA and police fiasco. A few days later, Harriet made good on her threat. I received a letter from the HOA's attorney demanding immediate cessation of any gatherings unless I went through the association's permit process, a process Harriet controlled. Permit requests are subject to board approval, it read, and decisions are final. Meanwhile, the letter claimed that if I refused, the board could pursue further legal remedies, including seeking a court injunction. I was dumbfounded. The neighbors who were sympathetic urged me not to give in, but others advised me to just apply for the permit to make Harriet go away. Yet that felt like giving Harriet absolute authority. I had done nothing wrong, and it was my home. A few days after that, a certified letter arrived from the county courthouse. Harriet and the HOA board were petitioning a judge to enforce compliance through an injunction. They alleged that I was operating an unauthorized club or association in a private community, in violation of the new HOA rules. I could hardly believe my eyes. If a judge granted this injunction, I'd be legally forced to cancel my gatherings, or face fines, possibly more. Out of desperation, I decided to hire my own attorney, an old friend named Mark Jennings. Mark was semi-retired but still took on cases he found ridiculous enough to champion. He agreed to help on principle alone, calling Harriet's actions an egregious overreach. That was the first time in this entire situation I felt anything like hope. I still wasn't sure how it would end, but at least I wasn't alone. I started preparing for what felt like an inevitable day in court. Harriet had built this case with surprising thoroughness, citing increased foot traffic and unknown visitors. She probably believed the judge would glance at her documents and immediately side with the HOA. After all, many people assume the HOA is always right. But I had my own facts. This new rule was never put to a proper vote, I had no neighbors claiming real harm, and the police visits had turned up nothing. Unfortunately, Harriet wasn't just going through official channels, she was also sowing suspicion in the neighborhood. Rumors circulated that I was involved in shady research, or that I sold personal information gleaned from genealogical records. The day of the court hearing arrived with a drizzle of cold rain that perfectly matched my mood. Mark Jennings and I found ourselves in a modest county courthouse, in a small, unimposing courtroom. Harriet appeared at the opposite table with a lawyer I didn't recognize. 2 board members sat behind them, flipping through thick binders. My side of the courtroom was virtually empty. Just me, Mark, and Dorothy, one of my genealogy group friends, there for moral support. I couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety. Harriet was a fearsome force, armed with meticulously typed documents and, for some reason, unwavering conviction that she was in the right. The judge, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, introduced the case. Harriet's lawyer stood up first, rattling off the HOA's perspective. I was in flagrant violation of a newly enacted rule that restricted repeated, unregistered visitors. Their argument hinged on maintaining community safety and decorum. The lawyer emphasized that, although the police had found no immediate wrongdoing, the HOA had the right to regulate foot traffic inside the gates of Green Hollow. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he addressed the judge calmly. "Your Honor, the underlying conflict here is that the HOA, led by Ms. Sullivan, unilaterally introduced a radical new provision with no community-wide vote, thereby bypassing the formal processes outlined in Green Hollow Estate's original bylaws. Furthermore, the gatherings Mr. Lehrman hosts are small, private, and pose no demonstrated threat. The HOA's stance is not only excessive but also unsubstantiated." He then presented signed statements from my 4 genealogy friends, each confirming the nature of our activities. Mark also submitted the relevant sections of the old bylaws, along with references to the state's homeowner association statutes, which typically require membership votes on significant rule changes. The judge asked Harriet's lawyer, were the membership voting procedures followed? The lawyer fumbled slightly, admitting that a formal ballot hadn't been conducted. Instead, the board had decided to adopt an emergency safety measure. Harriet sat stiffly, not taking her eyes off the judge. I saw something flicker in the judge's expression. Disapproval, maybe. But the hearing wasn't over yet. After brief deliberation, the judge addressed Harriet. "Ms. Sullivan, does the board have documented evidence of safety concerns, any instances of theft, disturbances, or property damage tied to Mr. Lehrman's visitors?" Harriet looked momentarily flustered. "Not specifically, but we've had break-ins in other neighborhoods. We can't be too careful." I felt my heart beat slow with relief. She had nothing concrete to offer. Still, Harriet tried one final tactic. "Mr. Lehrman's gatherings are more than just friends. He's hosting a genealogical research group, collecting personal data. He has no oversight. That's dangerous, especially for senior citizens who could be victims of identity theft." The judge's brow furrowed. "Ms. Sullivan, genealogical research is not typically associated with identity theft. Is there any indication Mr. Lehrman has misused anyone's information?" Harriet's posture stiffened. "Not yet, but—" The judge held up a hand. "Thank you. I believe I have enough information." Harriet looked furious but remained silent. The judge sat with her head lowered, making a few notes on a legal pad. Then she spoke, her tone measured and firm. "As it stands, the HOA's new rule did not follow the established procedures for amending or updating community bylaws. Therefore, it cannot be enforced. I see no legitimate reason to grant an injunction against Mr. Lehrman, who is hosting small, peaceful gatherings in his own home. I'm denying the HOA's request. That concludes this hearing." A jolt of exhilaration shot through me. I heard Dorothy whisper, "I knew it," behind me. Harriet's lawyer looked resigned, but Harriet herself was livid. She shot me a glare as if I'd committed a personal betrayal. Even as the judge left the bench, Harriet leaned over to her lawyer and hissed something. Moments later, Mark and I were out in the corridor. "Congratulations," he said, giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You had the facts on your side. Let me know if there's any further trouble." I would have been happy if that was the end of it, but Harriet had one more card to play. As we headed toward the elevator, she cornered us. "This isn't over," she snapped, her hands trembling. "I'll find a different route to ensure the community stays protected." I took a deep breath. "Harriet, the judge just told you there's no case here. Why can't you let this go?" She narrowed her eyes. Because you're not the only one who knows how to dig for information, Mr. Lehrman. You keep all those records, your genealogical data. Don't think I haven't wondered if you've uncovered something you shouldn't have. Her insinuation was bizarre. I stared back, confused. Before I could ask, Harriet stormed off. Later that week, I discovered exactly what she meant. As Dorothy and I continued our genealogical work, we came across an old record referencing Harriet's father, who once lived in Green Hollow decades ago. It appeared he had a criminal history involving property fraud. Suddenly, Harriet's behavior made sense. She was terrified that her father's past might come to light, and she suspected my genealogical group might dig it up. By trying to shut me down, she hoped to keep her family's history hidden. Though we had no intention of broadcasting Harriet's father's misdeeds, her paranoia had driven her to extremes, calling the police, dragging me to court, stirring up rumors in the neighborhood. Eventually, word of the hearing's outcome spread. Neighbors learned that the board's emergency safety rule was null and void. Many were relieved, others were irritated with Harriet for making them feel afraid without cause. Within a month, Harriet was quietly removed from her position as HOA president. A few neighbors, including Jim and Maria, rallied for a special election, citing her misuse of power. Harriet ended up moving out of Green Hollow Estates entirely. The rumor was that she found a condo across town, in a place without a homeowners association. Funny how that worked out. Life settled down after that. My genealogy group continued to meet, unbothered by intrusive notices or police knocks. In a twist I never expected, more neighbors started stopping by, curious about exploring their own family trees. The fiasco had revealed Harriet's true nature and ironically drummed up interest in the very activity she tried to ban. I still think about Harriet sometimes, wondering if she ever felt regret over the stress she caused or the money she cost the HOA. Maybe in her own way, she thought she was protecting something personal, her father's secrets, her image, or simply her illusion of control. But in the end, truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it. That's the story of how a harmless genealogical hobby turned into a wild battle with the HOA, complete with police visits and a court hearing. If there's a moral here, it might be this: never underestimate the lengths to which a misguided person will go to keep a secret hidden. And always check your HOA bylaws before someone like Harriet tries to rewrite them in the shadows.